Hi everybody, welcome back to the channel. In the next couple of episodes, we're going to be starting a new project, which is this lawnmower that I got from my grandfather. So thank you so much for giving it to me. In this video, we're going to try to get it running. So it has a Tecumseh 4.5 horsepower engine. It's a 4-stroke, unlike the original Lawn Boys, which was a 2-stroke, which in my opinion are better, but this is what we have, and I like it, so that's cool. Here's some parts I got for it. I got a new primer bulb, and I got a carb kit that we're going to be installing in maybe this video or the next video. Yeah, I'll do a little walk around of it. It's a cool feature is that it has a throttle control like that. It also has this really nice long dipstick, which I like. And this thing's in great shape for its age. It's from the 90s. But it's sat in his garage most of its life, so this thing's barely used, which is awesome. So now I'm going to get into what we have to do to this thing. Alright, so since this lawnmower's been sitting for probably more than 20 years, I guarantee you guys that the carburetor is going to be gummed up with old gas and varnish. So what we're going to do is remove it and clean it. Alright, so to remove the carburetor on pretty much any Tecumseh lawnmower engine, you're going to need a ratchet with a 3/8 socket, or you can use a large Phillips screwdriver to get to the bolts there and up there. So now I'm going to go ahead and remove them. For the bottom one near the exhaust, I'm going to use a screwdriver because the socket won't fit in there to get the head. And yes, this can be a little bit tricky. Sometimes you may even have to remove the exhaust. But it looks like we're good for this one. There we go. And now the top one. I think we almost have it there. I need to loosen it a little more. Alright, so once you have it loose like I do, now you can remove the fuel line with a pair of pliers or two. I like to use needle nose or these kind of adjustable kind. And you're also going to have to remove, if yours has one, the throttle cable. Oh, and if it's easier, you can take the fuel line right off the fuel tank like I did, because I'm just going to replace the whole fuel line because it's old and it's cracked and it's stiff. And I forgot to mention, you have to remove the 2 screws off this metal plate to get it off, to get the throttle control on. Alright, and there we go. There's the Carburetor Assembly. Now we can go take it over to the workbench and start removing some parts and cleaning it up. Alrighty, so now that we're at the workbench on a nice good surface, I'm going to remove the rest of this dried out fuel line, and I'm going to remove the intake pipe from the carburetor, and I'm going to remove the air filter plastic thing from the carburetor so that we can take a good look at this and clean it out. Alright, so to get the intake tube off of the carburetor, you're going to need a 7/16 wrench, and to get the nuts off, because there's 2 on each side. So I'm just going to hold this with my finger, or you could get a 3/8 socket to go on this and hold it if you want. So just go like this to loosen it. Man, that's tight. Or you can spin it off with the ratchet like this if it's easier. There. Now let's do this to both sides, and the intake tube should be off. Alright, there we go. The intake pipe is now off the carburetor. And now we're going to remove the fuel line and the air filter base adapter plastic thing. So to remove the air filter base, you're going to need a 1/4-inch socket. Or you can use a Phillips screwdriver, whichever works better for you. I like the socket better because it doesn't strip out the screw head like the Phillips screwdriver does. Okay, and what I like to do when I work on dirty carburetors is get a container and put all the dirty parts in there. And then after we're done taking this apart, we're going to put all the dirty parts in the container and put like brake cleaner or carb cleaner in there and let it sit overnight. Because the brake cleaner will loosen up all the crud and get it nice and clean. Okay, so now with a 1/2-inch wrench, we're going to get the bolt nut off and start putting all the dirty parts in the container. You don't want to round this because it's brass and it's kind of expensive to get a new one. There we go. And it's actually better to use a socket than it is a wrench. I'm sorry for telling you guys to use a wrench. So it's a socket. Ooh, this is dirty, wow. So we're gonna go ahead and throw this jet in the container. And now for the moment of truth, what does it look like? Ooh, ew. Alright, so I think before we put these parts in the container, I'm gonna clean them off with a brake clean, because this is pretty nasty. But if your carburetor looks like this, don't fear, because this is actually pretty easy to clean out and get going again. So in a separate container, I put some brake clean in the carburetor bowl, and just to agitate the dirt, you might need to use a toothbrush to kind of scrub it all off like this to get it pretty clean again. And then overnight we're going to also soak this in our container with the other goodies. You could also use a soft wire brush, that would work very good as well. Alright, so now that I have the carburetor bowl a little bit cleaner, I'm going to go ahead and put it in here with our rest of our parts. And now we're going to remove the float and maybe the seat and needle and clean them off and put them in there as well. So to remove the float, you're going to need a pair of needle nose pliers, just like that, to get the pin out. Then you can use your fingers, lift up like that. And wow, this thing wasn't even stuck in there. That's pretty impressive. So if you bought the new carburetor kit like I did, you're not going to need to save this part or the little seat, which is way down in there. You can just go ahead and throw those away, which I'm going to do. So to get the needle out of the float, you're just going to want to pull it towards you like that. And when you do this, make sure that you get it in the right, that you take it out the right way. And remember the way that you put it, that you took it out, because when you put the new one in, you have to put it in the right way, or else this won't work correctly. And you can go ahead and leave the bowl seal on there if you want, because the new carb kit comes with one. So to soak this, I'm just gonna use this own container because it's easier than having a big full one. And this part, you need to soak it really well, because you want to clean out pretty much 90% of the passages before you put it back together, and use a wire brush to clean out the rest of them. You can also take out the emulsion tube, which is down the center of the carburetor. That part you need to take out, or else it won't run right. Yeah. You could also remove the Welch plug just to make sure that you clean the carburetor really well. Alright, so now what I'm going to do, now that we have all of our parts in its containers, I'm also going to add the hardware just to clean those up too. So after you get all the parts in the containers, get some brake clean or carb cleaner. This is what I have. And I'm just going to let this sit in brake clean for a few days, and then come back and maybe use a wire brush and clean it up some more. So now just spray your parts with the brake clean and wait a few days. Alright, so really quick, I actually just cleaned the float off with a soft wire brush and some brake cleaner, just to ease the process of the grime getting eaten away by the brake clean. Now, if you clean any carburetor parts with a wire brush, make sure you use a soft one. And actually, this float is actually bad, because as you can hear, there's water inside, which isn't good, because that means the float will always stay in the open position and let extra fuel into the engine. So I actually need to get a new one. Alright, and I'm actually going to clean the carburetor a little bit first before I let it soak, just to again ease the process of letting it sit and clean in its own juice. Alright, so I just went ahead and actually wire brushed some of the parts before I let them soak. So now what I'm going to do is get some brake clean and spray the absolute heck out of all the parts, and I'll be back with you guys in a few days when they're all clean. And I might actually wire brush them before I put them on camera. Or, you know what, we'll just find out in a few days. Alrighty guys, so it's actually been a couple of weeks since the last clip, and now we're ready to install the carburetor, put it back all together. Alrighty guys, so off camera, I've actually cleaned up all the carburetor parts, and I've even purchased some new ones, like a new float, a gasket, and a carb kit. And I also put a new primer bulb in the carburetor, because the old one was shot, and this one's nice. So now, let's get all the parts back together, and maybe get the carburetor assembled on the intake. Alright, so the first step that I usually do is put on the new needle and the little holder, and then put the float assembly back in the carburetor like this. So just be careful. And then after you get it in the right way, make sure that you get the little pin in there to hold it in place. Okay, so I'm actually going to use the original float because I just actually soldered it shut, so there's no more hole in it, like you guys saw in the previous clip. The reason I'm going to use the original float is because the new white one here doesn't fit around the little thing here, and this old one does. So what I'm going to do now is get the needle assembly in here and get this back on the carburetor. Okay, and it should look something like this. And what you do now is blow into here, and then tilt this like this, blow into here, and you want air to pass through. And then after you do that, tilt it upside down, blow in again, and see if air doesn't pass through. Now, when you do it like this way, air should not pass through. If you can feel air blowing out, you're going to have to replace the seat, which is this little white piece right here in my hand. Sorry, it's a little bit hard to see, it's really small. So to do that, you can buy the Tecumseh like carburetor tool. It's kind of expensive, or you can use a crochet hook and get it out. So I'm gonna do this test now, and I'll tell you guys what the results are. Alrighty, so just as I suspected, it is good. So that's awesome. Now what we're going to do is install the new bowl gasket, which is here, and install the carburetor bowl back on. So as you can see, there's like a little divot here. This part goes towards the fuel filler thing here. So make sure you get it like that, and also put the gasket on. Oh, and when you're putting the gasket on, make sure don't get any fuel or carburetor cleaner on the gasket, because that makes it expand and then it's too big and it doesn't seal right. Okay, so the gasket should look something like this when it's on the carburetor, and it took me a few tries to get it on, but eventually I did, so that's great. Now we're going to get our bowl, and as I just mentioned, the divot here goes towards the fuel inlet, so just put it on like this. And now get the gasket for your main jet, which is this little piece, and then put it all back together. And you're going to need a 1/2-inch socket to tighten that. Alright, the gasket should look something like this when it's on the bowl nut. Now you're going to want to get this in the carburetor and put that in the carburetor hole here, and screw it all back together. And then after I do that, I'm going to attach the carburetor to the intake manifold with this new gasket that I got from the small engine guy. Okay, and to tighten the bowl nut, I like to use a little 1/4-inch ratchet with a 1/2-inch socket. That works pretty good for me. You could also use a 3/8 ratchet and a 1/2-inch socket, or a crescent wrench. That would also work. And you don't want to over tighten this, because you can then like wreck the gasket if you go too heavy. So be careful. This looks good to me. And if you use a box end wrench or an open end, I guess, be careful, because you don't want to round the brass nut. Alright guys, so the gasket I got from the small engine shop, they only had the snowblower version, which it works, but just be careful that you get the gasket lined up correctly, or I mean perfectly, or else you could have a big air leak and make your engine not run. So to install the carburetor onto the intake, you're going to need the bolts that look like this, and then one second. There we go. So it should look something like this when the bolt is in, and if you get the lawnmower version of the gasket, it won't stick out of the sides, but it's not a big deal if it does. It just, yeah. All right, and to tighten the intake carburetor bolts, you're going to need a 7/16 and a 3/8-inch wrench to get them nice and tight. And you're going to want to tighten the bolts evenly, because you do not want to warp the intake. It's an expensive part if you want to get a new one, but I guess if you do warp it, you can get a used one, which is always a good option. When I generally get parts, I try to get used, because I know they'll work and they're not as expensive as a new one. Okay, there we go. So maybe tomorrow I'm going to put this on the lawnmower and install a new fuel line. So I'll see you guys in the morning. Guys, so it's the next day, and I've made a new gasket for our intake tube to mount onto the engine. And now we're going to get the correct size fuel line on here and on the gas tank, and then reinstall the whole assembly in my hand here. So now let me just grab the fuel line, and I'll show you guys a trick on how to cut it with a nice clean edge. Alright guys, so I've got the fuel line on the carburetor, and now we are ready to attach the intake and carburetor assembly back onto the engine. And I almost forgot to do this, but we need to install this plate on where these two bolts go. So they're 5/16, so just take them both out, put the plate on, tighten it back up, and then get your 3/8 socket and tighten these two into the intake manifold hole on the engine. And then I'm gonna do that, and then I'll show you guys how to connect the fuel line to the fuel tank. All right, guys. So now we have to hook up this fuel line onto that little port right there. It helps to remove the air filter, so I'm gonna go ahead and do that right now. Just twist it like this, and it pops right out. Now that gives us a lot more room to cut our fuel line to the correct length and put the clamp on and get it on here. So now I'm gonna grab the knife to cut the fuel line to the correct length, which looks to be about right there. So I think using a knife helps keep a nice clean straight edge. That's just what I think. Yeah. Now I've got the clamp here in my hand, and I'm going to partially squeeze the clamp onto the fuel line to help it get on there. Now I'm going to put the fuel line on the fuel tank little port, and then tighten the clamp, and then we're good. So I'll get you guys back on when I've completed that. Okay, so now I've got the fuel line on the fuel tank, and now I'm going to reinstall the air filter and then put some gas in it, and we're going to try to start it up. Okay guys, so I've just added the fresh gas, and I'm going to prime the carburetor up with the primer bulb that I installed. Now we're going to see if it starts. A tip that I usually do is I use some brake cleaner or carb cleaner to just help get the carburetor primed up so it doesn't have to work as hard. So let's try starting it right now. And if it doesn't start, we'll spray some of this in there and we'll check and see if that helps. So here we go. I'm going to put it on slow as also. All right, so you guys just saw that it ran. Now we're gonna try to cut some grass with it. So yeah, let's give her a go. Full primes. Idle's pretty good. Wow, nice. Alright everyone, that's going to do it for this video. See you next time.